Hello, everyone. We are about to begin. So having given everyone a bit of a moment uh, to settle down, and what a session we have established today, and how important it is given the current situation in the world, the region, and the country. Now, I have the request to say a few words about our center. For those of you at UCLA, at there, we of course are at there as our center dealing with new developments of the Middle East. There are other centers, of course, who deal with other factors of this very important region, but we deal with the Middle East, and of course, over the last 14, 15 months, it has been very difficult, unexpected, and when you thought everything was over, suddenly it's back with other situations. And so I wanted to tell you that we have our calls like this. We have special meetings so that we meet some of the people who will be on today, and we are very fortunate of all universities around the country and the world to have the kind of people that we are able to talk to and who work with us. And you're going to see a fantastic discussion of a very difficult situation that we see today. But of course, all of this doesn't happen without funding. So if you know anyone, we're not asking you, but if you know anyone, parent, grandparent, friend, anyone, please let us know so that we can get in contact with people and get them involved in our program so that they too can experience this. We've done this with major countries, but the world has become so difficult, so complex, and so unexpected that we want to invite others as well. So there's such a large group today. If you have such a person, etc., if you don't mind some of your super amount of funds, we who are on, well, we'd like to talk and get you involved in some of the other things that we do. So let me turn the program over to the other Steve of our program, Professor Steve Zipperstein, who many of you know in class, and he will continue with what will be an extremely important discussion. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Spiegel, very, very much. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar on Syria. Before I begin, I would like to take a moment to thank very, very sincerely our UCLA co-sponsors, the Unison Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, and the Department of Public Policy and the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. Just a few logistical notes for the audience before we move forward. First of all, while you can see us, we cannot see or hear you. We are recording the presentation today. The video will be available on our website, our YouTube, and our Facebook pages in the next few days. If you're joining us via Zoom, please note that the chat window at the bottom of the screen is a place where we will share announcements during the talk, but you will not be able to put your own announcements or questions or comments in the chat box. Instead, if you have questions for our speakers, and we encourage as many questions as possible, your questions are really the most important part of the webinar in many ways. If you have a question, please type your question briefly in the Q&A window at the bottom of the screen. When you type your question, please make sure to include your name, your country, and or your affiliation. I will announce your name, your country, and or your affiliation when I read your question to the panel when we get to the Q&A portion of our webinar. Only the CMED team will be able to see those questions. The entire audience will not be able to see them. In some instances, we might answer your questions in writing in the Q&A window for others to see. And again, please keep your questions concise. That way, I'll be able to ask as many questions as possible. For those of you joining us on our YouTube platform, please note you will not, unfortunately, be able to ask questions because we have disabled the comments portion of the YouTube platform. Okay, let's get to our webinar on Syria. We have 4 amazing panelists today. I'm going to introduce them one at a time. Each of them will make about 7 minutes or so of opening comments. And I'm strict about the time, panelists, so let's not go too much over 7 minutes. Each panelist will speak for 7 minutes. Please, audience, be thinking of your questions. Type your questions in the Q&A box after each, or at the end of all 4 panelists, I should say, at the end of their opening comments, about the first half hour or so. I will then move to your questions and pose your questions to our panelists. So, without further ado, I'm pleased and honored to introduce our first panelist. He's joining us from the region, Dr. Amar Kaf. He is the co-founder and executive director of the Omran Center for Strategic Studies, a Syria-focused policy research center established in Istanbul about 11 years ago, also with an office in Washington, D.C. Dr. Kaf is also a founding board member of the Syria Forum. He earned a PhD from UCLA, I'm proud to say, in 2011. His dissertation was entitled Syrian Authoritarianism, Persistence or Change. His work focuses on geopolitical alignments, security and military architecture in Syria, and local governance in Syria. Dr. Kaf, please turn on your camera, turn on your microphone, and give us a 7 minutes of opening comments. Thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the team members and my proud UCLA, obviously, for hosting this. I was in Damascus last week, so I went there a few days after the collapse of the Assad regime. I can share with you that at least the majority of Syrians have witnessed a happy moment of relief, a cautious optimism that many Syrians share, that finally this was over. And now is the hard work, obviously. A lot of questions come up of this went too fast. It was 11 days. All of a sudden, the opposition forces, along with a few other armed groups, are launching towards a few villages in Idlib, and then to Aleppo, and then all the way to Hama, and then Homs, and then Damascus. I mean, so there are obviously internal factors and external regional factors. The internal factors are sometimes overlooked by a lot of analysts who only look at it as a deal by regional or international actors, but there is some agency. Non-state actors are not, fully proxies, are sometimes a hybrid form of actors. So they have learned their way through the last 10 years or 13 years in the different regions. So part of it is this internal learning process, the experience in Idlib and the north in terms of state building measures, what worked, what didn't, how to build momentum in the social infrastructures, developing drones. Obviously, it's not unique to HTS, Hayat Tahrir Sham, to develop drones, but many non-state actors in the world have developed those as well. But also the discipline, the military discipline, the human rights issues, controlling for all the different factors. What has been happening in the Northwest, and this is where I want to focus on this local agencies, that there has been 6 million, 5 to 6 million people squashed in a small geographic region, the majority of whom are internally displaced, with 2 million people in camps, with international funding going down, with a ceasefire under the Astana process that has never, no Syrian in the northwest have witnessed a real ceasefire because there were violations every day. Living conditions have gone down. Also, Syrians in the government-controlled areas have witnessed a huge economic crisis, a security, instabilities. The regime not able to maintain its contracts, its commitments. A lot of the Alawites, the different minorities have tried to migrate out of Syria during the last 2 years. All of those internal factors. So everybody's upset about the internal factors. Some of the regional factors have been obviously the Assad regime has been given so many chances by its own supporters and allies, including Russia and the Iranians. Obviously, one of the main triggers regionally has been the Gaza war and the Lebanon attacks on Hezbollah and the Israeli attacks on Iranian militias inside Syria that has really crippled the backbone support of the Assad regime. That's the number one. Before that came the Ukraine war, which took the attention of the Russians, and the Russians have become impatient with the Assad regime. We've received a lot of comments and notes from a lot of Russian actors close to policy to the Kremlin, telling us that Assad has a last chance. He's been giving a chance by the Arab League to normalize, to commit to very basic, conditions, and that hasn't worked. The Saudis have gone impatient and out of luck with him. The Jordanians as well. And of course, the last was the Russians. The Russians were not happy of the Iranian project in the region. At the same time, they did not want to be in the middle of many conflicts in Syria. They did not want to be in the middle between Turkey, the PKK, and the US. They did not want to be between Turkey and the Assad regime. They did not want to broker between the Iranians and the Israelis. They felt entrapped and that it's a lose-lose situation. And so the last action was by the Turkish government, Turkish president, putting a hand over to Bashar al-Assad. And the Russians were telling us as Syrian actors, myself as a researcher, that this is his last chance. I think HTS and a lot of local armed groups took note of all these different changes in the region, took advantage of the massive destruction of the Iranian militias, and struck in. And they were surprised. The plan was initially to go to Aleppo. Actually, the initial plan was even before that, and then it was expanded to Aleppo. And you can see that as an indicator of how the Aleppo was captured. 24 hours, Aleppo's back to business. I was there, 2 days later, and people were in the streets. You don't see armed, groups walking on the streets. They left the inner side of the city. Churches were preserved, all these different actions. So there was a textbook, there was a catalog that was given to them, or they developed it, or I would say both, of how to checkbox, how to get diplomats out, how to secure embassies and consulates and diplomatic missions in Aleppo, how to secure the industrial zone and the business community, all the different markets and so forth. So they went by the book. After Aleppo, the surprise was the amount of the collapse of the Assad, the government or the regime's military was massive. I think it was not even. It was a lot of people under. I mean, we as a Umran Center, we published a lot on the Syrian military, and we have always predicted that sanctions along with economic crises have really gone into the inner bones of the military, and the Syrian military really has nothing to stand anymore. I've seen last week when I was driving through from the north, you can see how old the equipment is, and they just left it on the streets. They left everything on the streets, and they disappeared. Syrian military, they felt that the first 3 days, Bashar al-Assad was in Moscow, and apparently the communication was cut. So there were some, rumors that he ran away, etc. But then he's back. So when he's back, Hama was already done. And so the progressing of the opposition forces was so fast to that it was not unexpected. And Damascus was supposed to be HTS and other armed groups were supposed to launch to Damascus, but then local residents in each neighborhood in Damascus started securing their neighborhoods because they saw, all the military bases emptied out. They saw in a way that I think it was a planned exit by Bashar to really cause this chaos in Damascus. Now there, I will touch base. So this is how it took place. It took advantage of the amount of destruction within the Syrian military infrastructure. No support by the Russians, no support by the Iranians, and so they immediately flew. And then there were also attempts by I would say the U.S. and some other European countries to broker deals, local kind of deals with the Alawite communities, Salamiya, the Aga Khan community, and a few other enclaves of communities across Syria to make sure they just put arms down and no fighting. And so there was very little bloodshed done. Any blood is obviously valuable, but overall the operation was fast, 11 days all the way to Damascus, and the regime, walking through Damascus, all these, no mukhabarat, no intelligence, no armed, the military. It's a different view of Damascus. Now, what is this HTS? What is this Ahmad Shara coming out of? Obviously there has been a lot of talk about, removing him from the designated terrorist designation, etc. But I can say, I mean, so far, the group has put out a lot of communiques that has assured regional actors and countries, maybe not enough to some, but has put out a relatively reasonable communication to the different governments, assuring them of, the different assurances to the Chinese, to the Russians, to the Iranians, to the Iraqis to tell them that we're friends with Iraq. Don't send your fighters over. That was another factor in the region. The Iraqis were afraid of any retaliation by the Israelis on Iranian militias, and the Iranians didn't want to lose the buffer of Iraq as well. So it was a win-win to a lose-lose to some and a win-win to others. And then now we have a new government in place, a de facto government in Damascus, meeting with all the diplomats and gaining some legitimacy by local communities. Not everybody's happy, but at least everybody's definitely happy of the removal of Bashar and that we're into a new phase. I think a lot of Syrians are engaging with this new reality and trying to see what could be brought out of it. Um, whether Ahmed al-Shara, abides. My clock is off for some reason, so I might be off of my
But
7 minutes. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
you actually are quite over.
So I'll
But
leave
I
the
let
rest
you
to
go
questions
because
then.
what you're saying is so important and so interesting. We'll have to save some for the Q&A, but maybe you can wrap up in about 30 seconds.
No, I'll leave that to Q&As actually.
Okay.
I'm done with the
Okay.
thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so very much. That was just really a terrific overview. So I've got some questions already from the audience. Keep the questions coming. We'll hear now from our second guest, our second speaker, Ms. Natasha Hall, who's a senior fellow with the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She has over 15 years of experience as an analyst, researcher, and practitioner in complex humanitarian emergencies and conflict-affected areas with a specialty in the Middle East, with lots of experience on the Syria file in particular. Ms. Hall has been a frequent guest on television and the media. We're very grateful to her for taking time to join us today. Natasha, the floor is yours for 7 minutes.
Thank you so much, Steve, and to the Steves more broadly at UCLA, to speak on this truly momentous event. So I want to take a step back and acknowledge that, because I feel like we've already bounced from this historic, unprecedented, earth-shattering event in the region and for the world, a conflict that has truly affected the rest of the world. If you look at migration, if you look at geopolitical dynamics, great power dynamics, the survival of the Assad regime during this war and its collapse will equally have ripple effects. I'm going to focus a bit on the U.S. dynamics. I think for the next 7 minutes, there's so many different things to talk about. But I wanted to start there with really how historic this is for people like myself, and certainly for people like Amar. You know, I have to pinch myself every once in a while to realize it happened. And this is from people that knew that the Assad regime was weak, that its victory was superficial, and that the status quo was unbearable. And still, I think just the rapidness of the rebel offensive takeover of Damascus is really quite stunning. And I start from that point because unfortunately I don't see a similarly radical or momentous turn in policy from DC. It seems like a lot of people have moved on to the grim realities of what this will mean for Syria and for the region, rather than sort of focusing on the positives, because there are many Syrians like Amar and Omran and many other civil society organizations that have been doing the hard work for many, many years, right? This is not an Iraq situation or a Libya situation where there was sort of a foreign imposed coup. This is a situation that Syrians have been fighting and dying for in the tens of thousands for many years now. But unfortunately, I think here there's yet another surprise in Washington, D.C., where maybe there shouldn't have been. But I think one thing that we should have learned from the past year is that dormant volcanoes don't remain dormant forever from Gaza to Syria. And I do hope that there's a bit more introspection on 14 years of Syria policy, because previously, just a few months ago, if you tried to speak with any U.S. government officials on Syria in any substantive way to shape dynamics on the ground for the better, you would have been met with hostility. I think there was a strong desire to put it all to bed. So in a sense, Assad was victorious because we decided he was. We decided that he was even more than his allies, apparently, Iran and Russia. And so I think the problem with that conclusion and the policy that was constructed around it is that it avoided these realities on the ground, that Amar was speaking to. And so I think, avoiding that unbearable status quo, as it were, was easy for White House officials in DC, and even for Bashar al-Assad, it turns out, from his palace. But that fragility of that status quo was readily apparent to everyone living it, certainly the people in the Northwest. We're talking about a population, the majority of which had not just been displaced once, but, in some cases a dozen times, losing their assets, over 1 million people in tent camps, etc. But I think what worries me about policy planning now is that I hope that there is a greater desire to deeply understand the reality on the ground, so that, the US and others are constructing a strategy, that's positive for Syria's future, rather than reacting to crises or what they perceive to be unanticipated events. And, of course, this isn't the first time this has happened, from the collapse of the Iraqi army in Mosul to Afghanistan to Gaza to Syria. As I said, the US is consistently surprised by things that maybe shouldn't be so surprising. So I do hope that this is a chance to turn things around during this momentous event. And I hope the new administration takes on that challenge, but also what I see as a huge opportunity. I want to sort of focus on what I think are 3 priorities in Syria today. Amar sort of laid out beautifully how this all kind of happened, from the geopolitical dynamics to the internal dynamics. So I'm not going to repeat any of that. But we are seeing some concerning events right now. So we've talked a lot about the potential for Syria being a failed state already. And I am concerned about that because I do think it's a bit of, a bit of the Mark Twain quote, rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. We're sort of jumping the gun here. And I fear that we're jumping the gun because there's so many other outside actors that are going to want a piece of this pie. And so we see that on multiple borders in Syria already. The Turks in their sort of allied militia groups have taken Tarrafat and Manbij from the Syrian Democratic Forces. This is the sort of umbrella grouping of U.S. supported armed groups in the northeastern, eastern part of Syria. There has recently been a U.S. brokered ceasefire, but there's also reports that Turkey and its militias are sort of gaining steam to keep going across to eastern Syria. And the reason that I think that that is I mentioned that as the first priority, is because there's about 9,000 ISIS fighters in northeastern Syria. And when the SDF has felt vulnerable before, there have been prison breaks. They know how to play that card. And since we have seen tweets from the president-elect that, there's no U.S. interests in Syria and all of that, it's another reason I mention it as a critical priority at the outset, because the withdrawal of U.S. troops would certainly create this massive vulnerability and sort of spoiler effect, not just for Syria, but for the region and the world potentially. Whoever controls these fighters will control quite a bit. Right. The Assad regime used these kinds of fighters and released them at critical junctures as leverage on the international community in the United States before as well. The second is, of course, designation, sanctions, reconstruction. I think there is a way to use these positively to impact governance and hopefully future elections in Syria. There is a lot of details that need to be worked out. How long it is before elections, who's eligible to run in elections, who's eligible to campaign in Syria, who's eligible to vote. There's a lot of things that need to be worked out. And so the United States and others have a lot of leverage to design this or to guide this in a constructive way for Syrians. And so that's sort of the second thing, and hopefully we'll get into that a little bit more in the discussion. And then I think, finally, there's a way for the United States and others to mitigate some of that of sort of effects of outside actors around Syria, namely the Israeli invasion of Syria and the 500 attacks on Syria. But I'm sure other states will also want sort of their own piece of the Syrian pie. And I think, truly the worst thing that can happen is that after living the trauma of the past 14 years, the trauma of not letting Syria succeed after all of this would just be, I think, too much to bear. As I said, this is not Libya or Iraq. Syrians have been doing the hard work. They know the hard work that needs to be done. And so I think allowing for that to take place would be another sort of positive policy for the United States and for Europe and others.
Hey, thank you so much for excellent comments. And as you were speaking, about 5, 6 more questions came in from the audience. Thank you so much, audience. Keep the questions coming. We'll get to, I hope, all of them when we get to the Q&A portion of the webinar. But now time to move on to our third speaker. Ambassador Hisham Youssef is a retired Egyptian diplomat. He was a senior Arab League official for 13 years. He served as Assistant Secretary General at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. He currently serves as a senior fellow at the United States Institute of Peace. Obviously, he has enormous experience working on conflict resolution throughout the Middle East region, and a long time and dear friend of CMED. So good to see you again. The floor is yours, sir, for 7 minutes.
Well, let me start by thanking you, Steve, and thanking Steve Spiegel as well as CMED. Start by a very brief introduction, followed by the challenges that I see for Syria, whether it's internal, regional, or international, and a few concluding words. In relation to the context, Um, what happened in Egypt, what took Egypt a few weeks to depose a regime, what took a few weeks for Tunisia to depose a regime, took Syria 13 years. And as Natasha said, this is historic, absolutely. And there are a vast majority of people that are happy that the Bashar regime is deposed. But we will see how these things develop because there are those who are not comfortable with the kind of rulers that are governing Syria at this point in time. Now, there are the three kinds of challenges or theaters of challenges: the internal, the regional, and the international. And as far as the internal situation is concerned, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was not alone. It is a coalition. So there may be also a fight over the political pie in relation to the future. Questions in relation to how the situation of the Kurds, particularly as they relate to Turkey, are concerned. And the situation regarding the Alawites and what happens with those remaining from the previous regime. They are not there, but this does not mean that this is over. And then finally, those who are returning to Syria, whether from Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, or otherwise, I think that will have all kinds of demands and would hope to see what happened to their homes, their livelihood, and so on. And this is a huge challenge. Those remaining from ISIS that were also mentioned by Natasha. On the regional level, we have Turkey that is seen as gaining from what evolved, and Iran that is seen as losing from what evolved. And Iran has been investing in Syria for decades. And I'm not sure that Iran is willing to forego its investment in Syria for these decades. And also they are not willing to see their lines to Hezbollah cut off in Syria. So they will not lie down and say, well, we lost this one. Let's see what happens next. Similarly, Turkey is very eager to see how they would deal with what they consider terrorist elements from the Kurds in Syria, and this also may complicate the situation at the regional level. And then we have also those who will be concerned that there is an Islamist political force that is governing Syria, and they have difficulty in principle in having these Islamist political forces rule. Of course, we have to admit that Golani has been vocal on all kinds of things that are positive and constructive, whether it's in relation to rule of law or in relation to minorities and their rights, or in relation to a number of important elements that are crucial for reasonable transitional period. There are those who are and hoping that the new system would deal with smuggling of weapons to Jordan, Pentagon, and otherwise. But also, this is a complicated situation at the regional level. Finally, at the international level, we have the United States and the West that hopes to see Russia out of Syria and may condition support to the new Syria by asking that Russia is no longer influential in Syria. And also, just like Iran, Russia has been investing heavily in Syria for decades. And Russia also will not want to see its investment go down the drain in as far as Syria is concerned, because Syria is strategically important for Russia, and it has a number of military bases there that has been operational and important for Russia's strategic situation in the region, and this will continue to be important. Another final point in relation to the challenges that I see is related to something that was announced by Golani, which is that he intends to establish a group of people that would draft a constitution for Syria. Constitutions are divisive in transitional periods, and I'm not sure how they will be chosen and what kind of balance and inclusivity they would have. And this may create all kinds of difficulties. I would have hoped that they would opt for something less complicated and more modest, a constitutional declaration of sorts that would be drafted by an inclusive group, which will also be controversial. But then it would be also seen as transitional. That would allow the situation to evolve during a transitional period. And after that, elections would take place. And based on that, they can, decide on how a new constitution can be written. So, we are hoping that things would move in the right direction and that, in Syria would learn from all the challenges and difficulties that faced all the countries in the region that passed through their own revolutions. And unfortunately, sadly, none of these revolutions succeeded. And the challenges for most of these countries, whether it's Libya, Syria, Yemen, or otherwise, have been huge and will continue to be difficult. But, at the same time, Syria will need help. And one of the main aspects of this help would be related to sanctions. And sanctions, as we all know, is a complicated issue. So we will see how the international community, how the region, and how the Syrian people would deal with the current situation, because I think the challenges are unprecedented, but also the hope is unprecedented. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much. And super important point in addition to what Natasha said, that nations should not turn their back on Syria. Okay, our final speaker, very, very honored to have with us Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich. He's a professor emeritus of Middle Eastern history at Tel Aviv University. He's also the former president of that university. He's the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. And most importantly, for purposes of this webinar, he was Israel's former chief negotiator with Syria in the mid-1990s. He's a distinguished fellow at the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Program. He's written many, many books on the modern Middle East. Again, most relevant for our purposes today. He wrote a book together with Carmit Valenci in 2021, titled Syrian Requiem, the Civil War and its Aftermath. His most recent book is Middle Eastern Maze, Israel, the Arabs, and the Region, 1948 to 2022. Itamar, another longtime dear friend of CMED, welcome. The floor is yours for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Steve. I hope I am visible and audible. No? Okay. So, in 1965, the British journalist and expert on Syria, Patrick Seal, wrote a classic book known as The Struggle for Syria. And it described the fashion in which the new Syrian state became independent immediately after World War II and ended temporarily its independent existence by merging with Egypt into the United Arab Republic in 1958. How during these 12 years, Syria could not be stabilized. It was the target of external forces, both regional and international, and it was the prey of internecine conflicts by politicians and regions and communities, and could not establish a stable existence. In 1949 alone, 9 coups d'etat took place, and behind each of these coups there was a regional or international power. The union with Egypt failed. It broke in 1961, and Syria continued to look for a stable existence, and it was provided to it by Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar, who seized power and for 30 years governed Syria. And he presented the Syrian public with a Faustian choice. I will give you stability and I will give you respect, because Syria will and did become a very important regional power, but there will be no liberty, there will be authoritarianism, there will be corruption, and there will be sectarian rule by the Alawite community that provided the inner nucleus of the regime. There were protests, there were outbursts of violence, but on the whole, Assad held Syria with an iron fist. This has not been the case with his son Bashar, not the original heir, who could not keep the country together. The civil war broke out in 2011. He was saved by Russia and Iran. And now, of course, his regime toppled easily. It was so rotten and so weak that it only took a push to bring it down. And the argument I'm going to make is that we are witnessing the struggle for Syria all over again. Domestic forces, most of them have been mentioned by my predecessors. The Kurds, the communities, of course, the Hayat Tahrir Sham itself, the Druze community, the Alawites, and others. I would like to add one more that has not been mentioned. That's the old opposition during the civil war. People on the ground, some of whom actually rose with the challenge put by Hayat Tahrir Sham. Actually, the first troops who entered Damascus did not come from the north, but came from the south, from residual groups that had been active during the civil war. So the opposition will probably claim a place under the sun. We were the opposition locally in Syria, and several hundred activists in Europe who were not very effective, but still represented the opposition. So that's another contender. External contenders have been mentioned by name: Turkey, Israel. I fully agree that with Hisham that Russia and Iran have not abandoned their expectations, are not willing to write off huge investments made in Syria, and massive interest in keeping the link that is Syria in Iran's maybe no longer alive land bridge to the Mediterranean, Russia with its 3 bases. And I'm sure that in a confidential, discreet manner, both Iran and Russia are trying to persuade Giuliani and his group not to sever relations and to let them keep at least some of their investment. And of course, the Arab countries, the so-called moderate pragmatic Arab states, who have a huge stake, because Syria is a very important geopolitical position. It borders on 5 states and has a Mediterranean shore, and whatever happens in Syria affects the whole region. And as the 2 camps that have fought for dominance in the region regard the Syrian arena as a very important place for them to maintain or even augment their support. I think that Turkey represents a major threat, because we should mention the fact that it has annexed 8% of Syria during the civil war. It regards the Syrian Kurds as an existential threat to Turkey itself, where 20% of the population are Kurds, and the notion of Kurdish sovereignty in either Iraq or Syria is seen by Erdogan and Turkey as a major threat. So we're going, I think, to see a very active domestic and international arena. The one missing voice is the United States. I think Natasha mentioned it, and I'd like to second what she said. President-elect Trump, during his first term, wanted out of Syria. He wanted to remove the 3,000 US troops from Syria. The Secretary of Defense at the time resigned because he told Erdogan over the phone, "Oh, if you want Syria, you can have it." He thought that was an irresponsible conduct by the president, and he resigned. And President-elect has tweeted a couple of times recently that Syria is a mess and the US should keep away. It would be an enormous mistake, because of all those forces, domestic and external, who want to see a stable Syria in place, they need to be led by someone, by a major actor. That actor can only be the United States, and I hope it will rise to the occasion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Itamar. Thank you to our panel. It's now time for our Q&A portion of the webinar. So if I can ask each of our panelists to turn your cameras on. And I want to thank the audience for your terrific questions. I have at least 15 questions here, and I think that means we're going to do 2 rounds of Q&A. I'll pose about 7 or so questions for our first round. I'll go back to our panelists in the order in which they spoke. I've told them that they are free to respond to any or all, some or none of the questions. I'll give each panelist about 5 minutes to respond to the questions, and let me get to them right now. We have 2 questions about the Kurds, which many of you have addressed already, but let me just indicate what the questions are. Sarwar Abdullah from Iraq asks, is it feasible for the Kurdish community in Syria to sustain their socio-political identity? And the other question about the Kurds is from Judy Nadell in the United States, who asks, is there any role, will there be a role for the Kurdish community in the new government of Syria? Roger Bowden from Canada asks, and Amar, this may be for you in particular, what happened to the Alawite 4th Mechanized Division? Do we know where their senior leadership went? Next question, and I'll just do a couple more. My very, very dear colleague at UCLA, Warren Fahmy, is asking, how confident are you that the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the incoming government will respect the rights of women and minorities? We've seen similar examples of groups making statements for public consumption only to become more repressive as time goes on. And then finally, another dear friend, my former colleague in the private sector, Max von Kesselstadt from Argentina, is asking, given the collapse of the Assad regime, how might these events impact Israel's already complex security landscape, particularly in relation to the existing fronts in Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, and beyond? Could this create a potentially new and destabilizing front? And to what extent might this scenario challenge the usual approach to regional security of the EU, NATO, United States, other actors in the region? And to go to Natasha's point, what could be the impact more globally if events in Syria spin out of control? Okay, we have many more questions. I'll stop there for the first round. Amar, the floor is yours for the first 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Great, thank you very much. On the issue of Russia, I mean, I've witnessed last week when I was exiting last Friday, Damascus, over, I would say, 6-7 miles of Russian troops exiting Damascus, going to the coastal areas, guarded by HTS forces. Now, what we hear from the Russians, from our contacts on the Russians, is that they're exiting even the naval bases. So that's yet to be seen in terms of what interest will they still have in Syria other than their embassies. But it seems like they have done a complete exit out of Syria. So they moved some of their troops to Libya, and the majority back to Russia. I have no, I'm yet to comprehend what are the implications of that. In terms of the Iranians, they're 100% out. They may have some pockets here and there, but they have also completely left out. Whether that is temporary or is that they're going to do a comeback, again, that's yet to be seen. But it seems like the Iranians have really got a huge hit from the Israelis in Lebanon, but also in Syria. And I don't think, and here I come to the next point. I think Turkey and HTS, etc. Let's say HTS first, and then Turkey as the backer. HTS is presenting itself to the US, to the world, is trying to frame itself as the only local armed group capable of kicking Iran out. This is also a message to the incoming Trump administration, obviously. And there has been some contacts as well with some of the members of the Trump campaign. So, directly or indirectly, I can't confirm, at least on record, but there has been some contacts. And there has been some contacts with HTS for the last several years, especially in terms of handing over coordinates or individuals wanted by some of the different countries, including the U.S. and Italy, and some of the wanted criminals. And so HTS has been presenting its credentials per se for some time. SDF so far has failed to provide that credential in terms of countering Iranian presence and Iranian activity. In fact, SDF is partially supported. Some of the members of SDF, the Iranian wing of the PKK, is supported by Iran, and again, that adds to the mix. And so HTS has also sent messages of in a goodwill, at least. I mean, all these goodwill messages are yet to be tested. I'm not saying that I'm promoting in any way, but I'm saying that there have to be some weight to them. They've sent some messages to the Kurds, assuring them of partnership. No. Jolani or Ahmed Shara has said that there would be no Taif type agreement, meaning sectarian-based division of power. There could be some decentralization, where our center has been promoting continuously and up until today, the idea of a second chamber, of more decentralized function. One of the things he's been doing the last few days is appointing some of the armed groups heads from Ahrar Sham and others to be governors of provinces away as far as Latakia and Tartus, away from the capital, so that he could be in control. I mean, that's some of the tactics, at least. So I see, in terms of the question of the Kurds, the messages from the incoming administration and the current one seem to be not very positive in terms of continued support. And that's why there's a lot of tension in the northeast between, Turkey and Turkish backed groups and the SDF. There's a ceasefire, and Jolani announced today again that either we have a united Syria with all of the territory belonging to Damascus, governed by Damascus, or we're going to war. SDF has Mazloum Abdi has also announced that we're going to destroy Tishreen Dam. If you do that, and it's on me and my enemies, as they say in Arabic. So there's also all these hidden messages and back and forth. There was a meeting yesterday as well in Omar oil base. On the issue of oil, I don't think we have much left in Syria. 40,000 barrels a day is not a huge amount to be able to pay for reconstruction, barely for some of the questions. Druze and Southwest, Jolani has met with a lot of the Druze communities the last 2 days, and just now I'm reading Sheikh Hajri, the head of the Druze, one of the Druze sects, has announced the call for a national national dialogue on the question of decentralization. So it's interesting how this is also playing out. Jolani provided these assurances to the Kurds, and it was responded by President Barzani in KRG region, who also did a goodwill response to the message sent by Ahmed Shara on goodwill towards the Kurdish communities and assuring them of constitutional rights and so forth. How this will play in the next few weeks, there is an attempt by Ahmed Shara to regain control over all of Syria's territory. Again, how will that roll out? It's yet to be seen. Just one last comment in terms of where did all these 4th Division senior leadership, some of them fled out, whether to Lebanon, to Iraq, Moscow, other countries, and some of them are still there. Some of the politicians, some of the heads of the And what HTS did is in the first few days is that they issued a temporary amnesty for 30 days, saying that once the military operations are over, then we will review each one of them, and those who have committed crimes against humanity will be held accountable. There has been very few, I mean, compared to the huge amounts of acts against, the crimes committed, 5, 6, 10 videos leaking out is a very small amount in terms of retaliation and so forth. There has been some good communication with the Alawite communities. I am told by some of the Alawite leadership in Latakia is that they are in close communication with both the Americans and the Turks, and that there are some agreements that HTS would not go in without coordination. So that's also been keeping the tensions down, and the focus is on, at least currently, on securing the country, stabilizing the region, and then potentially, he's saying that he's going to do constitutional committee. There's also a lot of doubts and suspicions by Syrian groups. What happens to the opposition? He's calling upon everybody to come in, not as groups, as blocks. He's saying that, the Syrian coalition is over. Its mission was to topple the regime, and it's over. Now come and join come and join the new government. Not as a bloc, but as individuals and group and social representatives, not as big blocks of political actors. I exceeded my time again. I apologize.
No, no worries whatsoever. Just so important to hear your perspective and your firsthand observations. It's very important, and we really appreciate it. Natasha, over to you for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to run through the various questions and not duplicate what Amar said. I mean, on the Kurdish question, the Kurds are incredibly vulnerable. They've created a lot of enemies, for better or worse, over the course of the past few years. Towards the south, I used to work on mediation efforts with Arab tribes in the south, and the Kurds. They're all supposed to be under this sort of Syrian Democratic Forces umbrella. And the United States has really tried to push for that, but it's been somewhat ineffective, and probably because of certain aspects of the counter-ISIS campaign, whereby Kurdish forces went into places like Deir ez-Zor, raided houses, or arbitrarily detained people on certain occasions. And we're basically seen as a sort of an authoritarian body kind of lording over a lot of Arab communities. There is also this perception that they are corrupt, that they have control of all this oil revenues, but none of it's going to these sort of impoverished Arab communities. Whether or not that's true or not, that's sort of the view on the ground. And so you would see a lot of sort of uprising in these areas at various points. And then, towards the west, the sort of the northwest, you had the Syrian National Army, the umbrella group of all this hodgepodge of opposition groups that had been, for the most part, displaced from other parts of Syria. And, Turkey gave them a meager salary and had basically been using them as mercenaries, not just in Syria, but in Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh, amongst other places. And they too probably see this as a way to gain more land and thereby more leverage in a future Syria with Turkey's help, and under the cover of Turkey. So it's not just doing the bidding of Ankara, I think, right now. I think it's also a way to grab valuable land. Oil revenues are still there. I mean, there's 40,000 barrels a day now, but I think there's a lot of rehabilitation of the oil sector that needs to happen. So it would be more, I think, if there was a stable, functioning sort of state. And I think prior to, I've heard different statistics on this, but before 2011, oil was something like 25 to 40% of the government budget. And then on top of that, the Kurds control this area that probably has about 70% of Syria's agricultural wealth, so fertile land, basically, as well. So, I mean, it is a prize in addition to those ISIS prisons, which I think also whoever guards those does have a significant amount of leverage over the international community more broadly. So I think the Kurds are in a very, very vulnerable situation right now. I think HTS has made sort of inroads to sort of communicating with them. General Mazloum issued a statement as the rebel offensive was taking place that they had coordination with HTS, or not coordination, but at least communication. But that said, I'm talking to people that are basically preparing for a siege on Kobani right now, despite the U.S. sort of brokered ceasefire that we saw in the north that recently stopped fighting. So I think the assessment by Turkey and others is that the Trump administration and the lame duck Biden administration is not going to be able to do very much about a Turkish incursion. So I do think the Kurds, or at least the Kurdish communities led by essentially the YPG, the predecessor to the SDF, is extremely vulnerable right now. The U.S. could have, again, a very positive role in, I think, ensuring rights for the Kurds, but certainly they're not going to control 100% of Syria's oil revenues in the future. On HTS and the respective rights of minorities and women, I mean, I'm going to be really simplistic about this. It's about politics. I mean, I don't think this is about Islam or they're Islamists in nature or whatnot. I mean, Jolani Shara has shown how pragmatic he is by essentially working with the Russians to maintain their bases. These are bases in which they launched thousands of attacks killing Syrians. I mean, that really shows, I think, how pragmatic they are. If you needed another reason to think of how pragmatic they are, they're allowing these sort of regime former officials into these local councils that they've created in places like Aleppo City, to the point where other people who've been brought into these councils are furious about it because they know that these people are responsible for a lot of the corruption that they suffered through over the years. So, I mean, I think really because this is about politics and consolidating power, if they feel like they're not getting anything in return for this pragmatism, for this inclusiveness, in the near future in the form of lifting sanctions, terrorism designations. These are things that HTS has been reaching out to the international community, by the way, for years on. And people like myself have been advocating for years for negotiations with HTS in order to improve their behavior in return for some kind of rewards. If there isn't that really sort of dynamic interplay, I would say, with the governing authorities, yes, of course we're going to see a reversal because they're not going to see any benefit to continuing this. Just really quickly on Israel, Israel clearly sees only military solutions to its problems, not diplomatic ones. I think that's a mistake for Israel's security and definitely a mistake for U.S. security over the long run. If you were a government in Damascus, seeing a country essentially, expel people from their towns, which is what's happening right now, along the border with the Golan Heights, and in addition to the destruction of critical civilian infrastructure to ensure that they leave. If you saw something like that, if you saw another army eliminating your military, within a couple of days, I think there will be a greater desire for them to consolidate power and reemerge as a stronger Syria in the immediate term without any of the sort of concessions of being conciliatory towards neighbors and whatnot. So I think, Netanyahu could be making the same mistake as Assad, which is just making too many enemies and pushing the envelope too far. So, and I will just close it out because I probably went over time.
You did, but that's perfectly fine. Again, thank you for your wonderful remarks. Hisham, over to you for 5 minutes.
Well, I probably won't take 5 minutes because I think Ammar and Natasha answered comprehensively a large number of questions. And I will stress 2 points in relation to the Kurds and minorities and so on. I think one of the most important points is that there has to be an incentive and disincentive system from the international community and the region in relation to team governing Syria. And as Ammar said, they will be tested. So, and this test will come very soon. So there will have to be some decisions, and we will find out from these decisions also how things are evolving. And to complement what Natasha said about Israel, Israel can worry about its security, and this is its right to worry about security. But I think the question is a question about how do they respond to some of these issues. So I don't think, I'm sure Itamar will be dealing with this issue, but I don't think that what happened in the last few years gave any indication that those who have been in control in Syria that tried to send assurances to Israel as well. So they send assurances to everybody. And yes, Israel can take its precautions, but I don't think that the attack that took place on the vast majority of the Syrian army was necessary at this point in time, because Israel understands and everybody knows the kind of challenges that is facing the new regime in dealing with all the difficulties that they have. And I'm not sure that they were going to have to cause any threat to Israel in any way at this point in time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Itamar, 5 minutes, and then we'll proceed with our second and final round of questions.
Okay, on the Kurds, I think a very important challenge for the new government or regime in Syria would be to create something that resembles a pluralistic political system. It doesn't have to be federal, it doesn't have to go into cantonization, but Syria is a very diverse society. 3 of the minorities are what we call compact minorities: the Alawites, the Druze, the Kurds. They are concentrated in certain regions. And a stable political system needs to address this reality, to give them a say in power. And without this, there will not be a stable Syria. And then on Israel, there was a question addressed to me, and then comments by Natasha and Hisham that I accept. I think the Israeli government overdid it. Not surprising for somebody like myself, like many other Israelis who deal with the excesses of the Israeli government domestically. They have been excessive also in Syria. Yes, it may have been, or probably was a good idea to take charge of the Hermon position, maybe to destroy chemical weapons and other weapon systems that should not fall into the hands of radical jihadi groups. Israel, like many others, still does not know what the character of the regime is. Note that the United States still has a prize on Giuliani's head, and that the US and EU still keep their sanctions against HTS. So, like them, Israel is in a wait-and-see mode. I hope that sober minds will prevail, and I very much recommend to my own government to establish lines of communication with the new government in Syria to avoid unnecessary misunderstandings. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. To our panel, I'm going to skip over some questions from the audience that I believe the panel has already addressed. So my apologies to those of you who wrote those questions. They were very thoughtful, but in the course of their commentary, the panel has addressed them. Let me just come to a few that I don't think have been fully addressed. And for our last round, I think these are very appropriate. The first one from our friend Hoda Awad in Egypt. She's asking, over the long term, how do each of you think Syria will end up over the long term? Not in the short term, but over the long term. And I'm rephrasing her question, but that's what she's asking. Next, very interesting question from Anna Otipkova. I hope I said it correctly. A Czech diplomat based in Kuwait. She wants to know, what do you think is going to happen to the Captagon market? And I would add to that, Captagon smuggling from Syria into Jordan in particular. Third, from another person from Czechia, Petr Stepanek, would like to have some more commentary about Iraq. Will the events in Syria cause Iran to double down in Iraq and try to use Iraq as a forward base to try to regain influence in Syria? And then the final question is from me. as the moderator. I would like each of you, if you wouldn't mind, to let's assume that we had someone from the new administration in our audience. I don't know if we do, but if there was someone close to the incoming president, could each of you offer your top 2 or 3 policy recommendations, specific policy recommendations for the new administration regarding Syria? Okay, we have about 18 minutes left. I'll give each of you 3 minutes, and then I need to make a closing remark for 1 minute in order to stay on time. And I'm going to go in reverse order because I want Amar to have the last word. So Itamar, I'll come to you first for 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'll take your question. Recommendations to the new administration. Make it a priority issue. Appoint a special emissary. I'm not sure that diplomatic relations will be renewed soon. There will be an embassy, but appoint a very senior, experienced, special representative. Try to find out from that person and through intelligence channels what the true nature of the government is, what the intentions are, make your policy choices, and play a leading role in trying to stabilize Syria as a key to stabilizing the whole region.
Okay, thank you so much. Hisham.
Well, thank you very much. Some of the questions are very difficult to answer. Long term in Syria, I have no idea. It depends on the interaction of the 3 theaters, internal, regional, and international. So we have no idea how things are going to evolve in a number of conflicts in the region, and Syria is one of them. Yemen is another, Libya is a third, Sudan is a fourth, Israel, Palestinians, and so on. As for whether Iran will use Iraq as a point to advance its interests in Syria, I think Iran will use all what is in its power to advance its interests in Syria. If the need arises and if they see that this is the only way, they will try. They will try all the options that they have in order to advance this issue. My last point is in relation to recommendations. I think one of the most important elements is what was mentioned before regarding having an incentive and disincentive system in order to advance Syria. But I hope that this would be done in a manner that would not include trade-offs with Russia on Ukraine, for example, to deal with this issue in a manner that would advance the interests of the Syrian people rather than in the context of either regional calculations for the US or international calculations in relation to its interest.
Okay, thank you. Natasha?
Yeah, quickly. So I mean, long term in Syria, I have no idea. I think the biggest issue for me is whether or not others will allow Syria to be successful. There's a lot of people investing in Syria not being a successful, flourishing democracy, and I think that's my biggest fear, that we will see a field. It'll essentially be a self-fulfilling prophecy. On the Captagon market, I know a lot of it has been burned. But this is a synthetic drug that can be easily produced anywhere. And so, we also have to think about positive, policy of the United States and others, ways to shore up a positive, licit economy in Syria and Lebanon and other places where there's a lot of economic struggles. Requires that kind of support and sort of lifting sanctions to allow for private sector investment, so that things like Captagon don't happen. In terms of Iraq and Iran, yeah, I mean, I agree with Hisham. I think Iran is going to double down in Iraq. And I'm working on sort of a chemical weapons project, and there's some sort of alarming reporting that they're also pursuing the production of synthetic opioids. And so I think that right now Iran is feeling very weak, and their people probably see that. And so I think their goal is going to be to shore up internal security by any means necessary. and that would include doubling down on domestic any kind of signs of domestic unrest as well. I already sort of addressed the incoming policy recommendations for Syria. I mean, I think overall, it's maintaining stability in the Northeast until there's some kind of sustainable peace agreement, both within Syria, but also Syria and Turkey, and the sanctions and the designations. I don't think it would be positive to just wait for a real economic collapse to just lift the designations and sanctions without concessions. And equally, I think it would be a big mistake to just drag our feet and not provide any incentives for good governance, and for Syria to rebuild its economy.
Okay. Thank you, Natasha and Amar. You've got your fellow panelists left you a little bit extra time, so I'm going to give you a full 10 minutes, but I'm going to cut you off at 10 minutes. So go ahead. You don't have to use all of it, but yeah, we are just so anxious to hear your firsthand observations.
Thank you very much. I don't think I have 10 minutes, but in terms of recommendations or moving forward, I think there needs to be more work put on prosecution and accountability on the international for war criminals who are now roaming around the world, including on Bashar al-Assad, and putting more pressure on that, as well as releasing a lot of the frozen assets, not necessarily to hand them over to HTS, but and this goes to the sanctions issue as well, to support local governance and to support direct services to people, to get the cycle restarted, the supply chain restarted. And this is where Syrians, I mean, we have also demanded that even before the fall and the collapse of the regime, there needs to be a lifting of a lot of the sanctions that are specifically directed to electricity sector, the fuel and energy sectors. Those are the sectors that directly impact people's lives, and those need, and including education and so forth, even though they may fall under general exemptions, but that's not enough. The overcompliance have killed, schools that I visited with no doors and no, and I know, I mean, the regime would suffocate its people and burn its resources, just to say sanctions are killing people, but it has done a lot of negative impact. So sanctions, assets, prosecution, accountability, and empowering state institutions, from the bottom up. So I would start from the bottom up, and that would create trust. That would empower. This is where you can leverage it by, pushing forward the idea of inclusivity, participatory structure system, and empowering Syrian civil society. I mean, Syrian civil society has been living in diaspora. Some of them are inside Syria are now. We're reconnecting actually the inside and the outside, and that's really a great thing to do. And we really need sanctions to be to a little bit more freely move around. So I'm going tomorrow to Damascus for a series of meetings from now until the next several days. So I think those are the things that will create an impact. Captagon price has gone 10 times, if not more. I'm hearing in Jordan this today we had a session on Captagon. So it has not disappeared completely. I mean, these things are not magic, but definitely it has been significantly crushed, and it's reflected in the price of the consumer price of that product. I don't know if I answered any of the other questions. There seems to be a lot of other questions. If there's anything specifically you can ask me, then that I can gladly answer.
Okay, well, I think this is probably a good place to stop. And Amar, as you were telling the story about Captagon prices skyrocketing because of the supply shortage, it reminded me about 30 years ago when I was a United States federal prosecutor, we had the largest seizure of cocaine in US history. I think even to this very day, 40,000 pounds of cocaine were seized north of Los Angeles. And a week later, the street price of a kilo of cocaine had not changed at all. And that gives you some sense of the mass amount of that particular drug that we were dealing with in Los Angeles all those many years ago. So no more anecdotes from me. It just falls upon me to thank our incredible panel for their willingness on such short notice to be with us today, to share their expertise and observations with us. Amar, please have a safe journey to Damascus tomorrow. Be safe while you're there. Um, and to our audience, thank you so much for joining. Thank you for your terrific questions. Again, I apologize for not reading all of them, but the panel did address all of the questions during the course of their comments. I want to thank our staff at the UCLA Center for Middle East Development, Salome Mohajer, Emily Pistole, and Laura Lee, known to many of you in the audience. I asked them 8 days ago, can we pull together a Syria webinar? And here was the result today. This doesn't happen by accident. The staff worked so incredibly hard on this, and I want to acknowledge and thank them for their efforts and to wish everyone in the audience a very happy and safe end of the year holiday season, no matter where you are or what particular holidays you celebrate. If you have not already joined our mailing list, and I'm talking to the audience now, please send a message to us. Our email address will appear in one moment on the screen, cmed@international.ucla.edu. We hope to see you next year, 2025, for more CMed programs and webinars. And with that, and I don't see there we go. There it's on the screen now. There's our website, our mailing list. As Professor Spiegel said at the beginning, if you know anyone, we're not asking you, each of you, but if you know people who might have the means or the financial capacity to make a contribution to our efforts, we rely solely on contributions. We do not have funding from UCLA. So please, all of you, if you know people, let us know. And then finally, before I sign off, want to thank again our wonderful UCLA co-sponsors at the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies and at the UCLA Luskin School of Affairs, Department of Public Policy. Thank you all. Happy 2025. See you next year. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.